Good day. Welcome to another session of Pop Tutorials. Today we are going to look at cost volume profit analysis, CVP analysis, what you also call the break-even analysis. And then we are going to try and then understand how to use the break-even analysis for decision making. We are looking at cost volume profits, which we call break-even. And then break-even means that you are at a point where you are neither making profits nor losses. In other words, total costs incurred equals total revenue. And when your total cost equals your total revenue, you are neither making any profit nor loss. And so we say you are breaking even. And that is what we call break-even analysis or cost volume profit analysis. Break-even is a situation where there is neither profit nor loss. We are going to look at a situation where the company or the organization did not make any profit or loss. Now, what we are going to do is to try and determine the number of units that is going to be produced in order to be profitable or in order to be at a position where you have left the loss area. And so we say that at the break-even point, total revenue must be equal to total cost. This is the break-even point where total revenue should be equal to total cost. In other words, there will be no profit and then there will be no loss. Then we call it the break-even point. Okay, so like I said earlier, we are looking at a case where total revenue is equal to total cost, meaning that there is no profit nor loss. You know that profit is the excess of revenue over cost, and then loss is the excess of cost over revenue. Now, we cannot let this analysis be perfect without holding some factors constant. In other words, there are some assumptions of this cost volume profit or break-even analysis. Now, the assumptions here are that 1, all quantities of goods produced are sold. That is the first assumption, because we are going to do an analysis where we will make no room for opening stocks and closing stocks. Then 2, we also assume that technology remains fixed and unchanged over the period of analysis. And then also, the only factor that is affecting cost and revenue is volume. And volume here is the quantity or output that we produce. And so there are a lot of assumptions of break-even analysis, but then I don't want to focus too much on the assumptions for now. What I want to focus now is to teach you how to understand the practicability of break-even analysis. And so we are going to look at the concepts, and I want you to follow carefully. Now, we are saying that at break-even, total revenue equals to total cost. Okay, and so for break-even, we will say total revenue will be, let me just keep revenue fixed here. But then let me try and then say that total cost is broken down into fixed cost and then variable cost. And so when total revenue equals to total cost, there is break-even. And that means that that means that your fixed cost plus your variable cost will be equal to your total revenue. This is the case where there will be no profit nor loss. Now, let us also try and understand that total revenue is also your selling price times your output or your quantity produced. Selling price times the output will give you total revenue. And so now selling price times output equals to your fixed cost plus your variable cost. Now, this is what we are looking at now. So we are going to look at a situation where there will be no profit nor loss. Now, what we are focusing on now is to find contribution. So we know that total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. And so total revenue should be equal to fixed cost plus variable cost. Now, we have a concept that we call contribution. And so contribution is different from profit. Contribution is when you have taken out your variable cost from your total revenue, and that should be equal to your fixed cost. And so if we have to bring the variable cost to the other side of the equation, we are going to have total revenue minus variable cost. That will be your fixed cost. Total revenue minus variable cost should give you your fixed cost in a case where there is break-even. And total revenue, or what we call sales revenue minus fixed cost, is what we term as contribution. So total revenue minus variable cost is contribution, and so contribution should be equal to your fixed cost. And so, ladies and gentlemen, what I want you to understand is the fact that whenever there is break-even, or whenever the organization is producing at a point where there is no profit nor loss, your contribution should be always equal to your fixed cost. And what is contribution? I'm going to go into the concept of contribution. Now, we know that profit will be equal to your total revenue minus your total cost. That is profit. And so these total costs also have fixed cost and variable cost components. Now, if you should eliminate the fixed cost component from your total cost, whatever you have now will no more be profit. It will not be called profit because you are not taking out total cost from total revenue. You are just taking out the variable cost from total revenue. And so whatever you have, instead of calling it profit, we call it contribution. Now, at the break-even point, profit is zero. So if you are taking out your fixed cost, whatever amount you have here should be equal to the fixed cost, because the moment you put in the fixed cost back, you are getting zero profit. That is at the break-even point. It means that at the break-even point, contribution should be equal to your fixed cost. This equation must be true at your break-even point. Okay, so now we have established that whenever there is break-even, total contribution should be equal to fixed cost. We have also established the fact that there is a concept called contribution, and contribution is your sales revenue minus your variable cost, which is your total revenue minus variable cost. That gives you contribution. Okay, and we also know that your sales revenue minus your variable cost will be equal to your fixed cost in a case where you are not producing at profit or loss. That means that this fixed cost should equate contribution. At a point where there is no profit and loss, fixed cost should be equal to contribution. Now, let us come back to the concept of contribution and let me try and explain something to you. Now, contribution is sales minus variable cost. Now, sales can be broken down into the selling price and output. Sales revenue is your selling price multiplied by your output. Variable cost is also your output multiplied by variable cost per unit. So it means that if we should take out the units, then we are going to have a selling price minus variable cost per unit. And that is going to give us contribution per unit. And so what we are trying to establish is that when you want total contribution, you look at sales minus variable cost. That is when the outputs are multiplied by the unit. But when you want contribution per unit, you look at your variable cost minus the you look at the selling price minus the variable cost per unit, and that will give you the contribution per unit. And so whichever one that you are going with, is either you are going for the total contribution where you have total sales minus total variable cost, or you are going by the contribution per unit where you have selling price minus your variable cost per unit. And that's going to give you the contribution per unit. Now remember that just not too long ago, we were trying to equate fixed cost to contribution. Look at the equation of fixed cost to contribution, total contribution. Fixed cost to total contribution. We are saying that we are looking at contribution towards fixed cost. And so at the point where we are making no profits or losses, total contribution equals to total fixed cost on a break-even point. So it means that we can look at it this way, that our fixed cost should be equal to Now total contribution can also be said as your contribution per unit multiplied by the output, because over here we took out the output. It means that here too could have been output by contribution per unit. That is when we try to take out the output from each side of this equation. What we are going to mean is that fixed cost will be equal to total contribution, and fixed cost will be equal to your contribution per unit times your output. Now, if your fixed cost is equal to your contribution per unit times output, then this is what we are going to have. If you want to make the output, because what we are trying to find is that we are trying to look for the number of units or quantity or output that we should produce in order to achieve break-even. And so if your fixed cost should be equal to contribution per unit by output, and we are looking for the output or the units to be produced, of course we can go by a simple change of subject and say that now fixed cost over the contribution per unit will be equal to the output. This is when you multiply or you divide both sides by contribution per unit to make output stand alone. We are going to have your fixed cost divided by a contribution per unit giving you output. And so, ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking for output that is going to give you the break-even, then your formula is your fixed cost over your contribution per unit. And this is what we call the break-even point in units. Okay, so we have established the outputs that we need to produce in formula to get the break-even point. And so here we are going to look at some formulas. And the formulas that we are going to look at, we are going to look at about 6 or 7 formulas that we are going to use in calculating these things. And so the first one, which I just established, is the break-even point in units. In other words, we are going to look for the quantity or the output that we need to produce in order to achieve break-even. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why we are doing this is that when you know how much to produce to achieve break-even, you know how much to produce to achieve profit. Because if you know that if I'm producing 10,000, I'm not going to make any profit or loss, that means that anything above 10,000 will achieve profit for me. Anything below 10,000 units will achieve a loss. And that is the essence of this analysis. And so our break-even point in units, the formula should be your fixed cost over your contribution per unit. Fixed cost over contribution per unit. That is the formula for break-even point in unit. Of course, let us remember that contribution per unit is your selling price minus variable cost per unit. Let us not forget that. The contribution per unit equals to our selling price minus variable cost per unit. Okay, this formula shouldn't leave us. We are going to work with this formula as well, that the contribution per unit equals to our selling price minus the variable cost per unit. So this is the formula. Your break-even point in units is your fixed cost over contribution per unit. And remember that to get a contribution per unit is your selling price minus variable cost per unit. So that is the first formula that I want you to know. The second formula is we want to look at, now we just looked at a break-even point, how to get it in units. Now let us imagine that we want to look at it in value, where there is monetary value attached to it. It means that when you get your break-even point in units, you can multiply that by your selling price in order to get the break-even point in value. And so your break-even point, if you want it in your sales value, it's your same fixed cost, your fixed cost over your contribution per unit. The same as your break-even point in unit. This time around, you multiply by the selling price of the product. And that is how you get your break-even point in value. Now, to get a break-even point in value, you need the selling price like I said. And then you can just quote this formula as break-even point in units multiplied by your selling price. And that will still give you that. Now, remember that I told you that the purpose is to set a target profit. We are not just interested in the break-even point. because we know that every organization or every business is set up to make profit. And so once we know the point at which we are making no profits or losses, let us try to set a target profit. And so we can decide to set a target profit, and then we will use this same formula, and the formula will tell us how many units or quantities of the product that we need to produce in order to achieve a particular target profit. And that is the essence of this analysis. And so we are going to look at the break-even point, or we are going to look at the output that we need to produce in order to achieve a target profit. So output for target profit. So when you have a target profit that you want to achieve, then what you are going to do is that the formula is going to be your fixed cost plus your target profit. You are supposed to add the target profit to the fixed cost. So your fixed cost plus your target profit all over your contribution per unit. So if you want to produce at a target profit, if your target profit is 100 cedis, for example, you add your 100 cedis. If it's $100, you add $100 to your fixed cost, which is there already, and you divide everything by your contribution per unit. You are going to get the number of units that will earn you that target profit. In other words, you are kind of inflating your fixed cost with the target profit, so that whatever unit that you have is still able to cover the fixed cost plus the target profit. And that is how come we set target profit with break-even analysis. Just as we were able to look at it for the break-even point in units, we are also able to look at it for value. The same way we can look at it that we want a target profit, but this time around we want to look at it in value. And so the same formula will apply, but this time around it will apply with your selling price. And so the output for target profit, this time if you want it in value and not in units, it's still going to be your fixed cost plus your target profit. Permit me to use TP for target profit all over contribution per unit. And then everything will be multiplied by your selling price. This is how to get the output in value that you need to achieve your target profit. And so these are 4 formulas. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are doing is that we are just looking at formulas, and then we are going to need these formulas, or we are going to use these formulas to be able to solve whatever questions that we are going to get. We need the formulas, and so let us try and get these formulas into our memories. Very, very, very important for us. The next formula that we are going to look at is called the contribution to sales ratio. Which we sometimes call CS ratio. Now, the CS ratio is very simple. Just as the name suggests, contribution to sales. And so the formula is your total contribution over your total sales times 100. It is defined in percentages. Total contribution over sales times 100. That is when you are using the bulk figures. You can also go by it in units, and so that's going to be your contribution per unit over your selling price times 100. Now, whichever way that you go, you should arrive at the same answer. Contribution to sales ratio is your total contribution over sales times 100, or contribution per unit over the selling price times 100, and that will give you the same answer, and it's going to be a percentage. Now, take note that the higher the CS ratio, the higher the profitability for the organization. The lower the CS ratio, the lower the profitability indicator. And so this is a profitability indicator. We use it to check the profitability of whatever that we are producing. And so get this formula also, because the example that we are going to solve, we are going to look at how to apply all these formulas for decision making. And then we move to the margin of safety. We are going to look at margin of safety. Now, what is the meaning of margin of safety? We are looking at margin of safety in a sense that, now let us take note. We are saying that, let us assume that break-even point is 100 units. Now, if break-even point is 100 units, it means that below 100 units, 90, 80, 70, down to that point, it means that anything that we produce below 100 is going to result in a loss for the organization. That also means that anything we produce above 100 units is going to, any quantity we produce above 100 is going to result in a profit. And so this is the break-even point. It means that at 100 units, the organization is making no profit and they are making no loss either. And so what we are going to do is that if we have a budget that we are budgeting for 250 units, or let's say 150 units, now it means that anything above 100, in other words, the range of this 100 to 150, if we produce here, we are safe. That is the word. We are safe when we produce between 100 and 150. Why? Because over there is a profit area. And so between 100 and 150, we are safe. And so margin of safety has to do with the range between your budgeted unit and then your break-even point in unit. Anything below the break-even point in unit, you are not safe. And so that is not inside your margin of safety. And so it means your margin of safety is going to be your budgeted sales units minus your break-even point in units. And this is how you find your margin of safety. Your budgeted units multiplied by your break-even point in units. Now, if you want to calculate margin of safety as a percentage, then you may have to divide this by budgeted units. And then you multiply the answer by 100. The same formula that you use to get the margin of safety in units. If you want to get the margin of safety in percentage, you divide through by the base, the break-even unit, budgeted sales unit, and then you multiply by 100. So whichever way that you go, this is for percentage, and without percentages, you don't divide and multiply. You just take to what is up to get your margin of safety. In the same way, margin of safety can be calculated with a sales value, and that will mean that instead of using break-even point in units, you are going to use the break-even point in value, and then you're also going to use the budgeted sales value instead of the sales units, and then the formula will still remain the same. Finally, I also want you to understand that the margin of safety can be calculated in a different way. Now, the margin of safety can be calculated using this formula, and the formula is profit over your CS ratio. So your profit over the contribution to sales ratio can also result in your margin of safety. So these formulas are very important for whatever that we are going to do. Like I said earlier, we are just focusing on the formulas for now. In our next video, what we are going to do is that, or in the part 2 of this video, which is going to drop very soon, we are going to take a practical example and calculate these things and then explain how we make decisions with them. Also, we are going to look at the graphical method, where we are going to use graph to illustrate the break-even analysis and see how to make profit with this analysis. But until then, I want you to subscribe to the channel, share this video, comment and let me know your suggestions and what do you think.